It is always interesting here at Varn for us to wonder why a socialist left has never been able to distinguish itself from progressivism. There's a lot of reasons in America why this might be the case, and from the work of Christopher Lasch to just the history of the progressive movement, there have always been reincorporations of socialist ideas into the progressive movement that often also use the same language, but to weaken them. And there are a lot of overlaps. There's going all the way back to William Jennings Bryan. Progressives were interested in monetary reforms, labor reforms, etc. And yet, we know with an upcoming, seemingly almost imminent fiscal crisis, that progressives at the municipal level are going to have a hard time. Now, I'm of two minds about this, and this is ultimately going to tie into a criticism that people have launched at me, that my ruthless criticism of most of the, quote, left, unquote, whatever that means, has been too pointed, too aimed, and not enough positive programmatic unity given. Now, I want to point out that the reason why I don't do that is, and we'll talk about this in the election of Brandon Johnson as Chicago's mayor, a theorist, or in this case, just a self-appointed media personality, cannot give you a blueprint for a program and has to emerge out of an actual organization with broad-based membership, if not mass-based, that has ties to other organizations which support it and aid it. There's a fetish of the party, and my argument has always been with both the anti-party and the pro-party sides of this debate is that the party is only as good as the institutions from which it emerges, and the movements from which it emerges, and the leadership which it can both cultivate but also hold accountable. If you cannot hold your leadership accountable, then your leadership will develop into an oligarchy. That's not just true in the capitalist sense. So Brandon Johnson narrowly but decisively defeats Paul Vallas, who was a extremely neoliberal candidate. And I mean that in the sense that he was a privatization zealot. He wanted to oversee austerity. And I think we should be heartened by that politically, that municipally progressives and socialists are doing better, I suppose. Although the irony at the core of this progressivism is that it's tied to many different things that don't necessarily have any cogent program any more than, say, a Lori Lightfoot. Lori Lightfoot, like Kamala Harris, comes out of this demographic-centered attempt by the Democratic Party to forward its leadership mainly by appealing to people who were largely ciphers, generally from legal backgrounds, so they can be strewed as tough on crime or at least not hostile to elements of the moment. But, and this is the big but, because of their sub-demographics, they were viewed as progressive because of cultural leanings. This seemed to be the only takeaway from that anyone had from Obama. And while I have many criticisms of Obama, this is the precisely wrong takeaway. Now, it's good that Johnson beat Vallas. Don't get me wrong. The Vallas campaign was bankrolled by all the people that you probably wouldn't want to deal with. $1 million of his donations from Trump donors, the backing of PACs founded by Betsy DeVos, hedge fund managers throwing money at him. And Vallas outspent Johnson 2-1, and he still lost. So on one hand, this is an indication of where urban politics and Democratic strongholds may be going. We also have seen similar victories of progressives in Los Angeles at the mayoral level, and with New York actually heading in the opposite direction after Bill de Blasio. However, Bill de Blasio should be a warning, as is the mayor of Jackson, Mississippi. Not that the mayor of Jackson is necessarily a bad mayor. In fact, I think he's absolutely, great. But Mayor Lumumba has been hamstrung by both state and federal lack of interest in funding. He's fought it. He's kept to his word to fight it. But has he had victories? The answer is largely no. If these mayoral candidates do not have larger movements on which to attach themselves, they are subject to larger political powers than themselves. While they're absolutely necessary to build a broad-based coalition to change, it's not clear to me that they actually can begin to separate their identity from the Democratic Party, nor do they have the kind of currency sovereignty that a national government would have to handle local funding issues if things get tighter, either from state funding or from federal, due to larger political polity, sectors like states and the federal government imposing austerity upon these mayors. And many times I find that we are running people on promises that they could do things like, tax the rich at a level of government where that's just not likely to have much of an effect. It's also pretty clear that, political stunts aside, Gavin Newsom and Ron DeSantis neither have declared are gearing up for some kind of longue durée political campaign. And DeSantis' Florida has been incredibly aggressive in this. Potentially passing an abortion ban at 6 weeks, past the Senate, that would even upset many pro-life conservatives in its severity. So the ideological politics in the United States tends to be swinging towards polarization, once again, despite Bidenism's empty neoprogressivism, as Dylan Riley and Robert Brenner might call it, seemingly holding everything together. The problem that I have with this democratic socialist movement is that there is an somewhat active denial of the limitations of its municipal strategy, while there is also a national refusal to really set up any means of breaking or holding Democratic electeds accountable. When the squad doesn't vote in the way the DSA advocates towards its members, there's nothing the DSA can do about it. We've talked about this over and over and over again. But one has to admit that this municipal power base is actually still probably a better way of building power than trying to make a long dash for the executive without having any regional or factional coalitions to build from. That said, I still don't see how socialists can develop an actual independent identity from progressives, and how people like Brandon Johnson, if the fiscal situation continues the way it is likely to go, won't be little hair footings. And by that I mean having to oversee austerity that they did not choose to impose. Like I've said, we've already seen similar problems with Mayor Lumumba in Jackson, Mississippi. What does this have to do with broader socialism? Is this just me doing my normal ruthless critique, everything you do is wrong? No, I'm actually pointing out here a contradiction, but it's a contradiction we should be honest about. These mayors, if they win, have to have a broader base politics and much broader base than the current DSA to connect to. Currently, the DSA largely, frankly, supports candidates but moves money from regions of relative unaffluence, if not poverty, into regions of affluence. A lot of the DSA's stronger chapters and a lot of the DSA's national is focused on New York and LA. And that makes perfect sense. It's where a lot of its members are. It's where it has a regional electeds of significant number, etc. But the dues are spread out all over the country. There has to be more than just cities for this movement to actually build, and there has to be other organizations. And there has to be some point where the DSA tries to establish itself as a separate identity from progressives, and perhaps from the Democratic Party itself, although when that happens, it's hard to say. There would be people who chastise people, the more radical ends of the DSA, for being frustrated with the Democratic Party because they're in areas where the Democrats have no power. But if you are only a sub-movement in areas that are already dominated by progressives anyway, then you're not really growing. You're just rebranding. But this brings me to the larger point. I've talked about the need for building dual power and para-institutional capacity. By para-institutions, I mean we have to avoid the pitfalls of NGOization and of ties to the Democrats. And any allegiance to any particular politics must be provisional based on our goals. It can't be subordinated. The Popular Front strategy has been a disaster for leftists in America. It's part of why they've never been able to establish an independent identity. And most aren't interested in it either. There's a natural capture there. Just structurally speaking, also, it's easier to capture the left because the right of the Democratic Party can defect, but the left has no meaningful group to defect to that has actual levers of power. And so, inevitably, at the national level, these politicians will have to move further conciliatory with elements of the Democratic Party. There's really no way structurally around that if they want to have any effect at all. You have to have built a movement at this regional level to do that. But if you're only building at the levels of places like Chicago and it gets stuck there, we can look at Khassama Sawant's building in Seattle, where she achieved a lot her first year, but she was in purely defensive mode the rest of her tenure. This is not a slight on her politics or her personally. There was nothing for her to connect up with, and even when the DSA existed, it still did not really provide a place for someone wants kind of politics to actually join in a meaningful way that could protect her and help her advance her agenda. Now, if we see this problem with people who have relationships to actual power, what do you think I would be doing if I gave you a program under these conditions? The conditions of immediate demands have to change based on immediate context, and we are in a different context now than we were in the last during the COVID years, although COVID's not gone, and during the years before. Along Derick goals, the orientations are the only thing I can tell you to establish, and most progressive orientations are not sufficient for what I want. Nor am I interested in purely national movements, as that in of itself would be open to capital flight, even in the cores of capital. Although, admittedly, the core stands a much better chance of restraining capital flight than other areas. We also have to deal realistically with the changing of the geopolitical system. Decoupling is going to happen. This, to me, is not anything that's inherently progressive, as some on the left might say. It's also not inherently bad. It's just a change of conditions. How you operate in it will decide if it's progressive for your goals or not. See, progress doesn't need to be measured generally or in moral terms. It needs to be monitored towards orientations and goals, which means we have to have those orientations and goals to model them. Merely getting progressives into mayoral positions will not in of itself build that unless we have organizations and institutions, our para-institutions, that have orientations and goals which we can progress towards. It is not enough to have negative partisanship. Yes, defensive negative partisanship unites people, absolutely. But you can't build from that alone. And when you build from pure negativity, you immediately descend into fractiousness. Solidarity can't be based purely on negativity, because the moment the initial block is slightly defeated, all kinds of fissures automatically show up that you have not planned on how to negotiate or integrate. This is why I'm not going to give you blueprints, and this is why it is not my responsibility to lead you. I'm here to educate you. I'm the wrong person to do that, to do the leadership job in that sense. I'm not temperamentally oriented towards it. I'm not necessarily that kind of strategic thinker. There are other people who are better at that. Go listen to them when you have questions about that. I will talk to them, and I hope that in talking to them, it gives you some ideas. I do think that the left needs to learn from religious organizations, MLMs, and things that we find otherwise odious, or at least politically neutral. And we also need to see where they slipped up. We can't mirror them exactly. Just like we can't mirror right-wing think tanks and anything like that. Our goals are different, and our different goals and orientations mean certain strategies won't work for us. But we do need to understand and learn them in a rich way. That's part of the point here. I'm not building castles in the sky, and I'm not trying to build a program which we can impose on people. The program must come out of the bases which build the politics that it is oriented towards. Our orientation is the only thing we can really build at this point, and institutions to support that. Then the program will emerge, and then programmatic unity is possible. Note that I am not talking about ideological unity. That is not merely an orientation. There's a whole lot more involved in that. It's not like we're aiming towards a free and egalitarian society. And by egalitarian, we mean power egalitarian, which would also, as a sub, necessitate wealth egalitarianism, as wealth is a measure of power, as a lot of other, to measure a lot of other things too, but that's one of the things that it measures. It does not mean, in my case, removing all provisional hierarchies. You will have people who are specialized. You will have people who have knowledge. But it does mean we have to fight many kinds of things at once, including conceding things to technocrats and people who tell us that technocrats should determine our policy, because they often are myopic, specialists in only one thing, and not able to see the larger picture. This is a rather sober and somber assessment, because I think we have things to be reflective about. We see all kinds of weirdo new movements that have emerged in the frustration of the current moment, and a lot of the left seemingly making excuses for the center. Perhaps we need to be more ambitious in making ourselves distinct from them. If you would like to support the show, there's a Patreon at Varn Blog. Find that on Patreon. There's also a free podcast where I put a goodly portion of the interviews on the show. You can find that on any podcast app. Like and subscribe, hit the bell, do all the things that you should do. I'd like to thank all my patrons. And recently we hit a fairly large number. I'm excited because I have about 400 patrons with a fairly small subscription base on YouTube. Although there are, I actually do better on podcasts, weirdly. But it may be because of the monetization algorithms. I'm not monetized, so I'm not making Google a whole lot of money. So they probably do not actually prioritize my videos in the algorithm. I don't know that, though. So maybe it's just people, maybe this is too close to just watching a Zoom. Who knows? But on that note, I'd like to thank you all for your support. Please leave comments, like, and share. And if you listen to the podcast, reviews are always welcome. Have a great day.